member in the Department of Public Health. I'd like to welcome you to today's seminar with Dr. Mike Siegel. We'll have our Dean, Shorty McKinney, introduce Dr. Siegel in a second. For those of you who aren't part of the class this year, this is part of a Politics of Health class, and of course, public health implications of gun violence are a political issue, and we've been trying to understand sort of politics behind health to understand, well, how do you modify those politics? How do you address those politics? You know, if this were so clear, and we'll hear about the evidence on gun violence, why aren't we just doing it? Why aren't we doing something about it? Well, because there's politics involved. So last year, after the shooting in Las Vegas, I had heard about it right before research methods class, and I went off on a rampage in class. And those of you who were in class with me know I threw up this slide, and I was like, well, look at how much research dollars are spent per life, per mortality, for different types of death or mortality. And gun violence is down there with falls and drowning. And why is that? Because there's politics involved in the research process and what gets funded and what gets researched. So anyways, as we were designing the class for the semester, I was like, I want to get someone to come and talk about gun violence, public health, and I knew that Boston University the School of Public Health was taking a leadership role in this, and one of the key people was Dr. Mike Siegel. So with that, I'm going to ask our Dean, Dr. Shorty McKinney, to introduce Dr. Siegel. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to some discussion.
Well, much thanks to Joel for organizing this seminar, and I'm glad that I see some people from classes, and there are a few others, and I'm glad that you're here. So Dr. Siegel has a very long, illustrative career in public health, and two major things would be his work in cigarette smoking, and then more recently his focus in gun violence. Some of you joined us for lunch today, and we had a fabulous discussion, and I hope that this seminar sparks some more conversation and discussion and helps deepen your understanding of the complicated issues related to gun violence. Those of you who are in the politics of health, so politics is one aspect, I want to take that word and put it into policy. And I know those who are public health students also take courses with policy as part of it. And sometimes you think of those as sort of boring, and what does policy have to do with anything? So during this presentation, I want you to think about how policy impacts what is happening around us, and what are the things that we all need to get involved with to change the policy which impacts the politics of health. So we are very fortunate to have a wonderful speaker with us today, so please be prepared to ask some questions, because that's where the sparks will start. So I'm counting on you to ask some questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here with you guys. So I'm going to do something a little different that doesn't usually happen in the classroom. So usually when you have a lecturer or speaker, their job is to give you information. And so if you came today thinking that you're going to come away with a lot of new information, you're wrong. I'm going to do the opposite. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take information away from you. I am going to take a lot of the myths that you've learned and a lot of the brainwashing that not just you, but everyone in our society has undergone, and I'm going to try to take that away from you. I'm going to ask you not to necessarily gain new information, but to forget some of the things that you thought were true. Challenge the way that you're currently thinking. So what I want to do is talk about the top 10 myths, what I consider to be the top 10 myths about the gun control debate, and try to dispel them. So we'll start with the first one, and this is the biggest myth about the gun control debate, and that is that there is a gun control debate. Anytime you mention the issue of guns and gun control, people are probably reacting in a way that, wow, that's a divisive issue. That's a really controversial issue. And I have to say that despite the fact that I've worked in the area of tobacco control, and I've worked in alcohol control, and now gun control, this is actually the least controversial issue I've ever dealt with. The absolute least controversial issue. There is no controversy here at all. There's no controversy. So you're probably thinking, all right, this guy's crazy. Where did they get him from? But let me try to show you why I say that. So it turns out that there's an unprecedented level of agreement on gun control policy in the United States. When you read the newspaper, it's not going to lead you to believe that. It's going to lead you to believe that this is one of the most divisive issues that is dividing our society. But it's not true. You've been brainwashed to think that. And I'll tell you who's doing the brainwashing in a minute. But there's actually an unprecedented level of agreement on gun control policy at a level that I've never seen before on any public health issue that I've worked on. So let's take the most basic gun control policy, kind of the bread and butter of gun control, which is having universal background checks. And so this is the concept that when you go and buy a gun, that there should be some sort of background check to make sure that you don't have a criminal history and that you're not going to be a danger possessing a gun. What percentage of the public supports that? Well, it turns out it's 90%. 90% of the public supports background checks. So you might say, all right, well, yeah, okay, that's great, but what about gun owners? Isn't there this huge divide between gun owners and non-gun owners? Maybe most of the population are non-gun owners, so there's great support, but among gun owners, there's going to be very little support. So let's look at that. It's exactly the same. There's absolutely no difference. 90%, 91% actually, of gun owners in the United States support background checks. All right, so you might say, all right, well, wait a second. Maybe this is a partisan issue. Maybe this is, we know there's a huge debate between Democrats and Republicans. These parties are at each other's throats. There's so much polarization. Maybe it's a partisan issue. So what about Republicans? How do they feel? Well, 86% support, overwhelming public support among Republicans for universal background checks. And then you say, okay, well, maybe it's a gender issue. Maybe it's, that the women are the ones who are supporting this, but men don't. Well, no, it's exactly the same 90% support among men. All right, so if you're still not convinced, maybe you're thinking, okay, well, yeah, this is Massachusetts, this is a liberal state. What if we go to some of the southern states, the much more conservative states? Maybe down there, things are very different. Okay, so let's look at that. Let's go to Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Kentucky. You can see in all of these states, there's overwhelming support for universal background checks. The lowest support in any state actually is Kentucky, but they're at 82%, which is an overwhelming level of support. Again, higher than anything that I've dealt with on any other public health issue. What about Massachusetts? Well, in Massachusetts, there's actually 98% support. I've never seen an issue where 98% of the public agrees on it. And again, it's not a partisan issue. Republicans are at 98%, Democrats are at 98%. And then you might say, okay, well, maybe it's just the issue of background checks. So let's take a more complex issue that is actually one of the most intrusive possible gun control measures, and it's called an extreme risk protection order. And what that means is that if you are found to be a threat to yourself or others, if you're found to be a risk to yourself or others, that you can actually have your gun confiscated. All right, so the NRA is always threatening that government is going to come take your guns. Here it is. This is a proposal where the government will come and take your guns away if you are deemed to be a threat to yourself or others. What is the public support for this?
Well, overall, 89% of the public supports this. And this is about as intrusive as you could possibly get in terms of gun control policy. You're actually taking people's guns away, yet there's overwhelming public support. In fact, more people support background checks and extreme protection orders than believe that the Earth revolves around the sun. So if you don't think that the Earth revolving around the sun is a controversial issue, then gun control is certainly not a controversial issue. And in fact, even fewer people know that July 4th celebrates the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and only 75% of the public knows that when we gained our independence, England was the country that we were fighting against. And public support for something that seems as basic as Social Security, and we know that no politician would dare touch Social Security. Even the most conservative politicians are not threatening to cut Social Security benefits. That only has 78% public support. So this is an issue that has more support than an issue that we consider to be pretty much universal, politically universally supported. So what's going on here? What's going on here? The truth is that the NRA has created this myth that there is this huge gun control debate. And they have basically brought this entire issue to a halt by brainwashing people to think that this is an incredibly controversial issue, that it threatens the freedoms of Americans, and that the government is out to take everyone's weapons, and that there is a complete polarization on the issue. So the reality is, the truth is that there's overwhelming public support for gun control measures. And in fact, the primary obstacle, the reason why we don't have these policies in place is not because the public doesn't support them. It's because of the tremendous lobbying ability of the National Rifle Association. Or to put this another way, from a different perspective, because it's not the job of the NRA to pass gun laws, but it is the job of our politicians, our policymakers, to protect the public. So to put this another way, the main obstacle to firearm violence in this country is that our policymakers have not had the courage to stand up to the NRA. It's as simple as it gets. That is the one thing that's impeding progress in this area, is that they just don't have the courage to stand up to the NRA. Okay, so then, you might say, okay, well, that's, all right, you've convinced me, yeah, there seems to be public support, but the NRA doesn't support these measures, so how can we get anywhere? If the NRA is so powerful and they don't support these measures, then we're not going to get anywhere. All right, well, so that brings us to our second myth. And that is the myth that the NRA's underlying approach to gun violence policy is inconsistent with proposed gun control measures or public health perspective on gun policy. We've all come to believe this and accept it. The NRA has a completely different way of thinking, completely different set of policies that they support. Well, let me ask you a question. What public health organization do you think it was that actually created the background check system that we now have? So if you buy a gun from a federally licensed dealer today, you will have to undergo a background check. Who do you think, what public health organization was the one that promoted that law? Any guesses what group it might have been? Yeah.
But it doesn't have something to do with the Brady Act, so
It was the Brady Act, exactly. That is the Brady Act. And do you know what public health group was the one behind the Brady Act? I'll tell you. It's a group called the National Rifle Association, right? The National Rifle Association was the group that actually created the very idea of the background check. It didn't come from public health. it came from the firearm industry and the National Rifle Association. They were the ones who basically said, we think that law-abiding gun owners should have guns and criminals should not, and therefore we want to create this background check system so we can check to see if people are criminals before we give them a gun. They were the ones who created the very idea. All right, you may say, all right, well that was back in the 1990s. Now we're in 2018, the world has changed, the NRA's positions are very different now. All right, so let's look at what the NRA's position is today. So first of all, how do they view, what is their basic conceptual way that they think about the problem of gun regulation? And this is a quote by David Keene. He's the past president of the NRA. And this is in a book that he just published in 2016. He says the key question is, how do we narrow the criteria for gun ownership in a way that will both protect society and respect those whose rights would be affected by unfairly including them? All right? So that's the NRA's philosophy for how we should go about this. Now let me share the public health philosophy. So let me give you my philosophy. What I think the key is to narrow the criteria for gun ownership in a way that will both protect society and respect those whose rights would be affected by unfairly including them. All right? In other words, there's no difference. The underlying conceptual hypothesis that the NRA supports is exactly what we in public health believe should happen. In other words, we need to figure out who is at risk for having a firearm and who's not, and make sure that the people at risk don't get access to them, and make sure that the people who are not at risk can have legal access to their firearms, and that we don't impinge upon their rights without any kind of without good reason. That's what the NRA believes. Let's look at their position on specific issues. Okay, so the NRA says the government is out there to confiscate your guns. They're going to take your guns away, right? So let's take a look. What is the NRA's position on having guns taken away from people? Surely they're against it, right? Or is that just another myth that you've been brainwashed with? Well, here's a quote from March 13th, okay? This is 2 weeks ago, just a little over 2 weeks ago. And this is their official position. This is the NRA Institute for Legislative Action. Quote, the NRA supports efforts to prevent those who are a danger to themselves or others from getting access to firearms, right? This is the definition of an extreme risk protection order, which is sometimes called a red flag law. In other words, if there's something that raises a red flag, and you think that somebody might be a risk to themselves or others, they should not have access to firearms. This is the official NRA position. And in case you say, well, that's a little bit vague, we're not sure exactly what that's referring to. Well, you can take it from Dana Loesch, okay? And this is someone who's not afraid to go on national television and basically ridicule 17-year-old kids who've just been through a school shooting, all right? But even she admits that this individual was nuts. And neither I nor the millions of people that I represent as a part of this organization that I'm here speaking for, none of us support people who are crazy, who are a danger to themselves, who are a danger to others, getting their hands on a firearm. All right? So there seems to be no debate here. Everybody, even the NRA, agrees that people who are a danger should not have access to firearms. And you might say, okay, again, maybe this is just, maybe it's taken out of context, or maybe she's not referring to these specific risk protection laws, all right? Well, let's see what Chris Cox says. He's the executive director of the NRA. It doesn't really get much higher than him. And this is what he said March 14th. Quote, we need to stop dangerous people before they act. So Congress should provide funding for states to adopt risk protection orders. He's specifically talking about the laws that many states are now considering. This could help prevent violent behavior before it turns into a tragedy. These laws allow a court to intervene and temporarily remove firearms when a person threatens violence to themselves or others. We can take action and prevent violence and protect the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens, Americans, at the same time. That's what the 5 million men and women of the NRA are committed to do, and we hope you'll join us in getting it done. Yes, I'll join you in getting that done. There's no disagreement. The NRA supports these extreme risk protection orders. So again, they created this myth that somehow there's this huge controversy, that nobody supports these things, that they're going too far, they're taking people's rights away, and the reality is, they're the ones who came up with the background check system, and they support taking people's guns away under certain circumstances. So it's pretty obvious. Here's a cartoon from the New Yorker just a couple weeks ago. You can see this guy's coming into a store to buy some Claritin and also an assault rifle. And what does the cashier say? He says, "I'll need to see some ID for the Claritin." All right? This is just common sense, right? It makes no sense. You need an ID to get the Claritin, but you can get the assault rifle, there's no questions asked. All right, so pretty much everyone agrees. So lesson number 2 is that the NRA's basic conceptual philosophy to gun regulation is precisely the same as that of public health. There's no real disagreement about the basic principle here. What's going on is a brainwashing. It's a brainwashing that people are just not aware of, and they're not willing to call the NRA's bluff and say, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, so maybe you're still on board with me and you say, okay, you're right, Mike. The public supports these laws. The NRA really conceptually isn't against these laws, but we have a problem because we have a Second Amendment in this country. Other countries can have very strong gun control measures because they don't have a Second Amendment. But in this country, we have a Second Amendment, and there's this conflict. There's this irredeemable conflict between firearm regulation and the Second Amendment. And in fact, the NRA will try to get you to believe that, in fact, there's a conflict. That, yeah, it would be nice to do all these things, but we can't because the Constitution protects people's rights to own a gun. All right, so let's take a look at that and let's see what the Supreme Court says, because the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of this issue. And in fact, in 2008, the Supreme Court made a definitive decision about this issue, and it was in the Heller case. The Heller case is the defining law on the Second Amendment, and they basically, the justices in a 5-4 decision voted, and they basically came out with the decision. So now remember, the vote in Heller was 5-4. Not everybody agreed with the majority opinion. So one justice wrote, and I'm going to read you what they wrote, and then see if you can figure out which justice it was. So this justice wrote that the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. From Blackstone through the 19th century cases, commentators and courts routinely explained that the right was not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose. Nothing, in our opinion, should be taken to cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places, such as schools or government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. Weapons that are most useful in military service, M16 rifles and the like, may be banned. All right? So this justice is basically saying that all of the laws that we currently have, because these are the types of things we do in state law, right? We regulate the criminal possession of firearms, we regulate where firearms can be carried, we have conditions on the sale and qualifications for the sale of arms, right? That's gun control. That's so-called, quote, gun control. This justice is basically saying, that's all fair game. That doesn't conflict with the Second Amendment. So which of the justices, so here's the 4 justices that voted against the Heller decision. Justice Breyer, Justice Souter, Justice Ginsburg, and Justice Stevens. These were the 4 on the minority side, right? So which of these minority judges do you think it was who made that statement emphasizing that although the Second Amendment does protect people's basic right for self-defense, it really doesn't interfere with all of the major ways in which gun control tries to control and regulate that possession? Anyone know which of the four it was? Any other guesses? Yeah?
Can I say all of them?
All of them? How about this? None of them. None of them. In fact, it was Justice Scalia. This was not the dissenting opinion. This was the majority opinion. This was the decision, right? And for those of you who are not familiar with Justice Scalia, he is, or was, the most conservative and strictest constructionist ever in the history of the Supreme Court. This is a guy who basically took the words literally and interpreted them literally, what they said on the page, no matter how relevant or irrelevant they were. So if the strictest constructionist, and in fact the majority opinion of the Supreme Court is that the Second Amendment does not interfere with most of these regulations, then certainly the Second Amendment doesn't interfere with these regulations. This is a complete red herring. The Second Amendment has nothing to do with gun regulation. There's nothing in the Second Amendment that actually has anything to do with 99% of the gun restrictions that we're talking about in our society today. There's really only one thing that the Second Amendment does not allow, and that's banning handguns. We cannot ban a complete ban on handguns. That would violate the Second Amendment. But every other policy that's being considered by Congress and state legislators are consistent with the Second Amendment. So again, not only is there a complete consensus, or pretty much of a consensus among American people, not only does the NRA's philosophy support these laws, but there's no Second Amendment issue. What's holding this up is not public opinion, it's not the NRA's opinion, and it's not the Second Amendment. What's holding it up is these myths. It's the fact that we believe these things, that the American people believe these things, and that they're not educated about this, that they've been brainwashed. Okay, I'm going to run through a couple of other myths kind of quickly here, because I want to get to the most important ones at the end to kind of give you some ideas of how we can maybe move forward from here. But you may have heard that the CDC is not allowed to conduct firearms research. Let me tell you why that's a myth. So in 1996, the federal government passed a law. It's known as the Dickey Amendment, and it basically says, well, let's look at it. Let's read the exact words. It says, and I underline the key phrase, it says, none of the funds made available for injury prevention and control at the CDC may be used to advocate or promote gun control. That's what it says. It doesn't say none of the funds may be used to research the causes and solutions for gun violence. It just says you can't promote or advocate gun control. What does that mean? Well, that means that the CDC couldn't come out and say, we urge politicians to vote for this piece of legislation, right? They can't advocate a particular piece of gun control policy, but there's nothing stopping them from doing basic research on firearms violence, which they haven't done since 1996, for over 20 years. And so, in fact, the truth is that what's been the obstacle to the CDC doing firearm violence prevention for the past 21 years hasn't been the law. It's simply been that the agency hasn't had the courage to stand up to the NRA. Any one of the CDC directors, if they wanted to, could have just said, hey, if you look at the law, it doesn't say we can't do gun violence research, so we're going to do gun violence research. But not a single one of the CDC directors was willing to stand up to the NRA. All right. A very quick one You may have heard that firearm deaths are on the decline, you know, that this problem is going away, and it's pretty clear that it's actually not. You can see the trend here in the number of firearm homicides over the last 3 years is increasing, and then the trend in suicides has actually been increasing for the past decade. So this is not a problem that's somehow going to disappear. So firearms deaths are on the rise, both homicides and suicides. All right, so let's say you're with me and you say, okay, yeah, Mike, we're with you. We understand it's the NRA that's blocking it. Well, if that's the case, why don't we just give up? Because they're just too powerful. We can't defeat them, all right? So let me bring you back to the eventful night of November 4th, 2016, when we had that presidential election. And let's look at what happened that night, right? Well, what happened on that night? Well, Donald Trump was elected to be our president, right? But that's not the only thing that happened. It's the only thing that got any attention. But there were 3 other things that happened that night that I want to tell you about that didn't make the news headlines. So first, 2016, there was a ballot initiative in Nevada for universal background checks for the entire state of Nevada. And in this ballot initiative, the voters on that night, the same night that they voted for Trump to be the next president, despite the fact that the NRA spent $6.6 million trying to defeat the universal background check initiative, it passed. It was close, but it did pass. California, the same night, same election night, they had a vote on a ban on large capacity ammunition magazines and a law that requires background checks for ammunition sales. So not just for buying the guns, but for buying even the ammunition for the guns, you would need to undergo a background check. This was fought by the Stop 63 campaign and the Coalition for Civil Liberties, and the NRA and other gun groups spent more than $1 million fighting it, but they got trounced. An overwhelmingly defeat, 63 to 37%. And also on that night in Washington, there was a vote on extreme risk protection orders, the law that we've just been talking about. You can see the NRA is fighting it here. This is a news alert they sent out to their constituents saying vote no on 1491. Let's see whether their voters listen to them. No, they got trounced. I mean, decimated. 69 to 31. That is about as big a trouncing as you'll ever see in any kind of political campaign or vote. So the truth is that the NRA can't be defeated, and we've done it, and we can especially do it if the issue is brought to the public. If you actually go to the public, and not necessarily politicians who are afraid of losing office, we can defeat the NRA, and we've done it. Okay, myth 7 is that firearm violence should be viewed primarily as a criminal justice problem. If you ask the American public, is the criminal misuse of firearms a public health issue or a criminal justice issue, the majority of the public, over 80%, will say that it's a criminal justice issue. Right? That's pretty resounding opinion there. And if you ask them if the government should classify gun violence as a public health issue, most people disagree with that. And so you might say, okay, well, why does that matter? Why does it matter whether we classify gun violence as a criminal issue or a public health issue? And the reason it matters is because of this slide, which is, should the CDC spend resources on gun violence? The CDC is the nation's #1 public health agency. So it makes sense that if you don't view gun violence as a public health problem, if the public doesn't think that gun violence is a public health problem, then why should the CDC be spending money on it? And so over 80% of the public doesn't think this is something that the CDC should be putting money into. And the reason for that is because they've been somewhat brainwashed into thinking that the issue of gun violence is a problem just because it's a criminal activity, right? It involves criminal activities. So what percentage of gun deaths are due to crimes? I'll just give you two choices. Is it most of them, or is it less than half of them? It's actually less than half of them. It's only 1/3. How could that be? How could 1/3 of gun deaths be due not to crimes? Well, the answer is because they're suicides. They're suicides. They're people making a decision voluntarily, presumably not being coerced, although there was one case where that may have happened, but presumably making their own decision to take their life. So these are not, the majority of these are not crimes. So how could it be a criminal justice problem if most of these cases are not even crimes to begin with? When you have 36,000 people dying a year from a problem, that is a public health problem. Now, I'm not saying it's not a criminal justice problem, and I'm not saying that there aren't aspects of this that criminal justice is involved in, but clearly, this is a public health problem. And we're not going to find a solution until we view gun violence as a public health problem. Okay, myth number 8 is the more guns out there, the safer we are. So you may have heard this slogan. Oh, you'll see this headline after the shootings. What was the first thing that NBC News was covering? Well, they were saying we need to have more guns, not fewer guns. Okay, so that's the solution to this problem. We have the shooting in the school, 19 people are killed, and the solution is we need more guns to protect people. And what's driving that? Well, here's a book that John Lott wrote called More Guns, Less Crime. And basically putting out the hypothesis that the more guns there are, the more that inhibits people, it deters people because they're afraid that if they try to commit a crime, somebody out there might have a gun and shoot them. But there's another school of thought, so you can actually buy a book that says More Guns, Less Crime, or Rebuttal. So this is a book for whichever side you're on. And in fact, there's an article called More Guns, More Crime. So there's plenty of material out there for whatever side you are on. And in fact, you can even get a bumper sticker for your car that says More Guns, Less Crime. I'm not aware of any bumper stickers that say More Guns, More Crime, so some of you are going to be out of luck. But you can just put these, tremendous variety of colors here you can choose for your car. So in public health, to answer questions, we rely on the research. What does the evidence show us? And so I want to show you what the evidence shows. So we've done a study where we looked at the rate of youth suicide in each of the 50 states, and we plotted that against the percentage, the household gun ownership percentage. In other words, what percentage of households in that state have guns in them? And you can see each of these red dots is one of the 50 states. And you can see there's a striking relationship. In fact, we found that the #1 predictor of the rate of youth suicide in a state is how many households in that state have guns. If guns are available, youth are going to be using them, and therefore the suicide rates are higher. And we found the same thing with homicide. It's not as striking of a relationship, but it's still there. As household gun ownership goes up, the firearm homicide rate also goes up. And then we look more specifically at laws that regulate permits for concealed carry. And we compared states that basically allow anyone who wants to carry a concealed weapon, as long as they don't have a felony conviction, versus other states like Massachusetts, where if you have any kind of criminal history of violence, you're not going to be allowed to carry a firearm, even if it's not a felony. And lo and behold, what we found is that the rate of firearm homicide was about 9% higher in the states that allow anyone to have a permit. So the empirical evidence seems to be answering this question by saying, no, it doesn't look like more guns, less crime. it looks very clear, the evidence shows that the more guns there are out there, certainly there's a higher rate of suicide. In fact, it's the #1 predictor of youth suicide. And it also appears to be an important predictor of homicide rates. Okay, myth number 9 is that there is a gun culture in the United States and that it explains the high level of firearm violence. So I have to admit something, which is that I used to believe this. When I first started doing gun violence research, I believed this. Actually, to be honest, I believed all of these things at one point, until I started doing research and finding out that things were very different than they seemed. But at one point, I did believe that there is a gun culture in the US, and the reason why we have such a high level of firearm violence is because of our gun culture. So why do I say that I no longer believe that? Well, one of the things that changed my mind was I looked at the trends in the rates of sale of different firearms. So this is the number of firearms that are being sold each year in the United States. And you can see that in 2005, something interesting happened. It was pretty much flat, and then all of a sudden in 2005, there was this huge spike, especially in, the red line is total firearms, but you can see that the white and the blue also go up sharply, and the white is pistols, and the blue is rifles. So there was a huge increase in 2005 in the number of weapons that were sold. And you can see that not only was there an increase in the pistols, but if you look at the caliber of the pistols, there was a particular type of pistol that was being bought in huge numbers. And that is, you see this blue line and the red one. And so those are your 9mm caliber pistols and your 50 caliber. In other words, the large caliber pistols. What does that mean? What are those for? Those are for self-defense, right? You don't need a 50 caliber pistol to bring down a deer or a bird, right? So these are self-defense weapons. So I started thinking, all right, wait a second. That's a pretty striking graph. Something must have happened in 2005, right? You don't have to be trained in statistics to look at this graph and say, gee, wonder what happened in 2005. So we started looking at that, and lo and behold, we discovered, if you look at this, so what we did is we looked at trends in different types of state laws. And you notice, if you look carefully, there is one type of state law that something seems to have happened in 2005. And it's this solid line here, which is stand your ground laws. And you can see that there was basically none of these, or maybe only one of these, in 2005, and then all of a sudden it took off, and now there are about half of the states in the country that have it. So what is a stand your ground law? A stand your ground law is a law that basically says that you are allowed to protect yourself using lethal force, meaning you can shoot someone if you feel threatened of severe bodily harm. In other words, if you're afraid that somebody is going to commit a felony against you, assault you, you can shoot them and ask questions later. And this was the kind of law, this was the law that let George Zimmerman off the hook for killing Trayvon Martin, because he was able to claim that he feared for his life and therefore he had to shoot, and that was what got him off the hook, and he was not held responsible for that murder. So that's what stand your ground laws are. So you might say, okay, well, what does that have to do with the increase in the sale of weapons? Well, here's what it has to do with. What happened is that these laws didn't just introduce themselves into the state legislature. The reason that these laws were introduced is because the NRA in 2005 decided that they were going to try to change the way they positioned their guns, the way they marketed their guns. They were facing a problem. The percentage of people that were using guns for hunting and for sports was dropping. You can see, especially for sporting use, the yellow bar here. You can see that up until 2005, there was a large number of people, but then it plummeted, and so did the use for hunting. So the manufacturers came up with a clever idea. Let's package and repurpose these products and market them, instead of for hunting and for sports, let's package them as self-defense, for self-defense. Let's convince people that they need these weapons for self-defense. And so let's wage a campaign, a propaganda campaign, to convince people that they've got to protect yourself because you never know when somebody might break into your house in the middle of the night and kill you. So you have to have a weapon for self-defense. And it worked. People are motivated by fear, okay? Now, what are the chances that someone is going to break into the middle of your house in the middle of the night and shoot you? Well, it's actually less than the chances of getting struck by lightning. So if you're really worried about your safety, the first thing you should do is not get a gun. It's to conceive some sort of lightning rod and walk around with it all the time, because you're much more likely to die of a lightning strike than you are of some intruder coming into your house. But nevertheless, it worked. And now, in 2015, when people are asked, what is the primary reason why you own a gun? They say, for self-defense. So the lesson here is that, why do I say there's not a gun culture? Well, because there's multiple aspects of gun culture. It's not, if you just say there's one gun culture, you're lumping all gun owners and all gun ownership together. There are different types of gun ownership. There are different reasons why people own guns. You can't just lump all gun owners in as if there's some entity of, yeah, I'm a gun owner. Like that makes everyone the same. No, there's different reasons why people own guns. Some people own guns because they like to hunt. Some people own guns because they love target shooting. Some people own guns because they like to just collect them. Some people own guns because they want them for self-defense. Some people own guns simply because they were handed down to them and they don't want to get rid of them. Some people own guns because they just like having them and looking at them, literally, like you would collect art. So there isn't a single gun culture. There are multiple gun cultures, and some of these gun cultures are not related to violence. In fact, our research shows that some of these cultures are negatively related to gun violence. We found that the more people in a state that read hunting magazines, the lower its homicide rate is. That seems crazy, right? But it's true. The more people that read hunting magazines, the lower the violence rate is. So how could that possibly be? Well, the reason is because the hunting culture is a positive culture, or it's not related to violence, right? Someone who owns a weapon for hunting is not owning that weapon because they want to kill other people, or is at high risk for killing other people. So it's not just that there's a gun culture. We need to look specifically at what the gun culture is and how it's changing over time. And most importantly, how is the firearm industry and the NRA marketing the product? What do they want to make us think about what the purpose of guns are? And that brings us to our final myth, which I'll close out with so that I can take your questions. So this last myth is that gun culture is a problem, that we should not have high respect for gun owners because of how severe this problem is, and that gun owners and NRA members are the obstacles to progress. And here's why I don't think that's true. So gun culture is not the problem. The problem is the way that the industry has been marketing the problem. In other words, the way they've been asking us to think about gun culture is the problem, not the gun culture itself. The gun culture itself is not necessarily unhealthy. You know, using guns for hunting, using guns for recreation and sport, even having them for self-defense are not necessarily dangerous things or problematic things. But the way that the NRA and the gun manufacturers want us to think about guns, the way they've marketed this issue of firearm violence is a problem because it's brainwashed us into believing all these different myths. So what do I think we need to do to move forward? I think the key thing that needs to happen is for us to recognize that this is not an issue of gun owners versus not gun owners. It's not even an issue of citizens who don't belong to the NRA versus NRA members. The issue needs to be exposed for what it is, which is the American public who all agree uniformly, none of us want our children to be killed when they go to school. I don't care how conservative you are, or if you voted for Trump, or if you believe the world is flat, or you believe the earth revolves around, or the sun revolves around the earth. Everybody believes that their children should be able to go to school without worrying about getting killed, right? Everybody believes that people who have a criminal history shouldn't have access to firearms. There's no divisiveness, there's no division, it's been artificially created. It's not gun owners versus non-gun owners. It's not Democrats versus Republicans. It's the people. It's you, it's me, it's all of us versus the NRA and the industry, which is creating and marketing these myths. And in fact, I don't think we are going to get anywhere unless we actually start respecting certain aspects of gun culture. One of the things that I've been doing, I never pictured myself doing this, but spending a lot of time with gun owners. I've been spending a lot of time in gun shops, trying to understand the different types of weapons, trying to understand why people buy them, going out with the Wayland Chief of Police to a shooting range next week. And I'm having a safety lesson first, he assured me. So trying to really understand what it is that drives people and what their values are. And what I've found so far is that the values that gun owners have are exactly the same as the values that I have. You know, we all believe in freedom, we all believe in security. And we all believe that to achieve that, there needs to be reasonable regulations and restrictions on guns. But what we do need to do, if we're going to succeed, is to change this cultural image that guns are some sort of protector of freedom, and that any type of interference with that is taking away our freedom and risking our democracy. And we have to dispel these other myths that are dividing us. So thanks so much, and let me take your questions now for the rest of the time.
Great. Thanks, Mike, and I'll let Dr. Siegel just answer. Just when you ask the question, say who you are, and we'll go from there.
Yeah.
So, I'm Taylor. I'm in Joel's politics and health class. And why do you think politicians in the CDC haven't stood up to the NRA? Is it because of I know politicians, some of them are funded by the NRA or receive money from the NRA, but is there any connection with funding from the NRA to the CDC?
So it's a great question, because you're right in that you can easily explain why some politicians haven't stood up to the NRA, because if you're a politician, you have to win re-election, and many of these politicians are getting money from the NRA, so that would explain why they might not oppose the NRA. But the CDC is not getting money from the NRA. It's not an elected office, so they don't have to run for office, so why haven't they stood up to the NRA? And the reason is, I've thought about this a lot, and I've come to the conclusion, it's just a lack of courage. They haven't been willing to. Nobody has been willing to stand up to the NRA until very recently. The first person that I ever saw in my lifetime who was willing to stand up to the NRA was Emma Gonzalez, right? It wasn't someone in my generation. And I think that is why the situation is totally different now. I think that's why this issue has been transformed. It's been transformed because someone had the courage to stand up and say, quote, "I call BS," right? Because that's what basically this lecture is saying. I could have titled this, "I am calling BS," right? That's the name of this talk. But nobody was willing to stand up and say that until Emma Gonzalez got up and said those words. And so I think that transforms the whole thing, because I think that will now give people the courage to be able to join those kids and say, all right, if they can do it, it's now safe for us to do it. And I think that's going to completely change the issue. Yeah, there was a question in the back, yeah.
My name's Marina. I'm also in Joel's politics class. So you mentioned that the NRA's approach to gun violence policy is inconsistent with like the gun control measures. But so then later you were talking about how they have lobbied millions of dollars towards California, Washington, all of those laws. So if they are saying that they're on the same side, then how can they say that when their action from their money is elsewhere?
So, great question. And the answer, I think, is the same as I just gave. It's because nobody's willing to call BS on them. You know, I mean, it's complete crap, right? That they are coming out with this statement saying we support extreme risk protection orders, and then in all the 50 state legislatures, they're lobbying against them. It's completely, you're right, it's completely inconsistent. You can't be for something and then lobby against it and have any credibility, right? So the problem is not that whether they're, you know, what their position is. The problem is that nobody has been willing to stand up and say, look, this is complete BS. You know, on the one hand, they're saying this, they're doing something else. So I think a lot of what has to happen is really exposing this for what it is, and exposing the organization for what it is, and pulling gun owners away from the rhetoric that they've been hearing. But I think to do that, there has to be a little bit of change in rhetoric on the other side as well. Because a lot of the posters that I've seen in some of the marches and things like that are saying things like, you know, we need to get rid of guns. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with expressing those sentiments, but that is the kind of propaganda that the NRA has been using to convince people that the government is out to get their guns, that people who support gun control are out to get their guns and take their guns away. And that's not the goal at all. It's certainly not my goal. I mean, there are already 250 million, if not 300 million guns out there. So we're not going to take them away. You know, I don't even know what you do with 300 million guns, right? So we're not going to take them away from people. What we are going to do is have more rational restrictions. So I think that we need to change the way we talk about the conversation. I think we need to open it up, and I think we need to have conversations with gun owners. I think we need to bring them in as part of the solution, not part of the problem. And in fact, I'll tell you, after one talk that I recently gave, a very prominent person at Boston University came up to me. I won't tell you who it was, but he was a very prominent person at the university. And he said, you know, I'm a gun owner and I'm an NRA member. And up until this talk, I always felt like, even though I know that what the NRA is saying is just so much of it is garbage and I don't support their positions, I still feel really strongly about the NRA because I think they're protecting our constitutional rights. And I feel violated by and not respected by so many people because they think just because I'm a gun owner, I'm part of the problem. And so after he heard my talk and he realized, oh my gosh, this, you know, people are actually respecting us. He said, you know, I'm totally switching to the other side, and now I'm going to oppose them, their positions, because now I feel respected. We did the same thing in tobacco control, right? We had the problem that the issue was being made out by the tobacco industry to be a battle between smokers and non-smokers. That's what the industry wanted people to think, and they brainwashed the public into thinking that it's only people who don't smoke who support having higher taxes on tobacco, restricting the age of sale of tobacco, restricting the places where you can smoke, right? So they created this myth, just like the NRA has, that smokers and non-smokers are completely at odds. There's no room for moving forward, we're at a standstill. And what we did is we brought smokers onto our side. we realize that there are common values that everyone agrees with, right? Nobody wants kids to smoke. Not a single smoker that I've ever talked to has said, I am so pro-smoking, I think kids should smoke. Nobody's ever said that to me. So they were on our side in terms of the actual policy, the reasonable policy solutions. And by doing that, we stripped the smokers away from the tobacco industry, and they could no longer get people to sign up for their organizations. The National Smokers Alliance, which was the equivalent of the NRA, the NSA, just one letter different, the NSA literally disappeared overnight because there was no one to join it anymore. Once the smokers realized that the industry wasn't even looking out for their interests, they were just trying to make a bigger profit. So I think that's the kind of thing that needs to happen with this issue.
I'm sorry, can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
But so why do you think that they come out into the public, like why do you think Chris Cox says this specific position, and then is there a reason that he says his position is a certain way? Is it for publicity? Is it so that he doesn't seem like a bad guy? Like, why do they say that if then their actions aren't the same?
It's because the Parkland kids had the courage to stand up. That's why. They forced the NRA's hand. They would never have done this in the last, ever in my lifetime, right? They're doing this because they're desperate. Their back is up against the wall because these kids literally have taken them by the throat and pushed them against the wall in a way that I could never do, adults could never do. My generation never did it. These kids have done it. And it's the fact that they're being threatened that all of a sudden they could be delegitimized. These kids have come very close to delegitimizing the NRA publicly, and that's why it's like their backs are against the wall, so they have no choice. They've got to make some sort of statements to kind of make themselves look a little bit more legitimate, just to save some semblance of legitimacy. And we saw the same thing with the tobacco companies. The more they were pressured, the more they started making statements little by little by little to get back into the mainstream of society. And so first they said, yeah, we actually admit that smoking isn't so great for you, all right? Something they never would have said before their backs were against the wall. And then a little later on they said, yeah, well, yeah, it does cause heart disease and cancer. And then a little later on they said, yeah, secondhand smoke isn't so good for you either. And then a little later they said, you know what, we're gonna let you listen to your doctors and to public health authorities, and we're not gonna tell you what we believe about the health effects. And so little by little, because their backs were against the wall, they had to kind of, just to retain any sense of legitimacy, they kind of had to moderate their position. So I think that's what's happening to them. Yeah.
My name's Joe, and I actually have two questions. The first one goes back to the first myth, in which there was, the first myth was there is a gun control debate, and you went into the details about the background checks for, North, South, Democrat, Republican, statewide. And as an avid gun owner, I can reaffirm that I wholly believe that the gun should not fall into the hands of the wrong people. But I feel like, do you think that myth number one would be more tailored to say there is no background check debate, considering gun control within itself is such a broad topic, that the background checks itself don't do justice, and there are vast more gun debates in terms of modifications, specific owning of distributing of certain rifles or handguns, the capacity in which you can carry these guns, places you can carry these guns. So would you feel it would be more gated towards there's no background check debate as opposed to gun control itself?
So I guess what I would say is that I wouldn't say that there isn't a gun control debate, because I still think that the main gun control measures that we talk about, for the most part, are things that are that most gun owners support. Background checks, not allowing criminals to own guns, having some restrictions. I think what I would say instead is that there are some areas of regulation where we in public health have to have a better understanding of what guns are all about. Because I think there are some areas of regulation where we are making arbitrary decisions that are impacting negatively on gun owners without actually protecting people. So, and I'll give you an example of that. and that's assault rifle bans, okay? So here's the problem. What is an assault rifle? All right, I mean, it sounds great, right? No, it seems pretty logical we shouldn't have assault rifles. Okay, but now when we actually write that law, what is an assault rifle? Well, if it's a rifle that can be used in assault, then all rifles are assault rifles. So what is it that makes an assault rifle an assault rifle? So maybe you could say, okay, well, that they're semi-automatic. That semi-automatic rifles are assault rifles. Well, a huge percentage of rifles that are sold are semi-automatic rifles. So it can't be that. So if you look at Massachusetts law, here's the way they define an assault rifle. It's a rifle that has 2 of the following 5 features, all right? One is it has a foldable stock or a telescoping stock. All right, so that's kind of the edge of the rifle, the back edge of the rifle, that either you can fold it or you can kind of move it in and out to adjust it. In other words, an adjustable, you can adjust it, right? That's a cosmetic feature of a rifle. That's not, that doesn't make it deadly or not, right? It doesn't, having the type of stock isn't going to affect whether it's lethal, right? It's not going to really affect the lethality. A pistol grip is the second thing, all right? So if you just have that little thing where you can rest your finger, that makes it an assault rifle, all right? That doesn't seem to make much sense to me, because how does that make it more lethal, right? A third thing is a bayonet, bayonet, yeah, right, exactly. And so, but how do, you know, if somebody's using it, putting a bayonet at the end of it, that actually makes it, I would think, less dangerous, right? Because they're not going to do as much damage with that. Plus, how many people walk around with bayonets at the end of their rifles? Again, I think it's mostly a cosmetic thing. The fourth thing is the flash suppressor. That has nothing to do with the lethality, right? And then the fifth thing is a grenade launcher. Now, a grenade launcher sounds bad, right? Because, you know, you certainly don't want people launching grenades. But the reality is that the only grenades that you can legally buy are, I believe, the .37 caliber, and those are just flares, right? You cannot buy legally a grenade that kills people, right? So even if somebody were to use the grenade launcher, they can only really use it as a flare, which it doesn't cause damage. So the reality is that none of these 5 features, and tell me if you disagree, but it seems to me like these 5 features don't really make a weapon lethal that wasn't lethal before. Does that seem reasonable?
Wholeheartedly agree, yeah.
Okay, so I think what's happening is that because a lot of us in public health have never held a gun, don't know much about guns, that there is a tendency sometimes to go down a pathway of regulating these weapons based on just a feeling of uncomfort. Because what really bothers us is when we look at the gun, right? Because they're black. An AK-47 looks bad because it's black, right? If it was yellow or white, I don't think we'd be as scared of it. So I think that in order to have rational public policy, we do need to get a better understanding of what the weapons are all about. And this is why it's important to understand gun culture and to bring gun owners into the debate, because they can help kind of give us hints when we're going down a pathway that is more arbitrary than actually related to what's going to result in saving lives.
I was just going to ask, so are most of the guns that we have that are causing most of the problems legally or illegally accessed? Because everything you've talked about today is really through legal channels and having the regulations that are going to support everything that everybody seems to agree on.
Right.
But the other side of it is where the homicide and violence is happening with guns that aren't necessarily falling within that radar.
Right, so really there's 2 parts to the answer. The first is we don't really know, because it's really hard to get data, and we don't have a data collection system which collects data on when there's a crime, when there's a gun crime, was that gun obtained legally or not? There's no data on that, so it's very difficult to answer. But with the limited data that we do have, the answer is that it depends on the situation and the type of violence. So for example, suicides, which are 2/3 of all firearm deaths, typically the guns are legally owned, right? You don't need to traffic a gun to have a gun for suicide. So 2/3 of the deaths right off the bat are legally owned guns that presumably, if there were stronger restrictions against the legal sale, people would have less access to them. And then as far as homicides go, it's very different based on geography. So in urban crimes, in urban areas, there's a much higher prevalence of trafficked guns, illegally owned guns that are coming into these neighborhoods. And so gun trafficking is a huge problem in urban areas. In other areas, in more rural areas, it's not as much of a problem, and they're using legal guns. And it also depends on what state you're in. So states with stronger gun laws, there's going to be more use of traffic guns because it's harder to get the guns. So there's no kind of clear-cut answer, I think.
So we have time for one more question, if anyone has a question. Yeah, go ahead.
And this goes back to the third myth, in which there was a conflict between regulation and Second Amendment. And I was just wondering, was it somebody's presumption or legislation brought forth that deemed, other than banning handguns, everything else is consistent with the Second Amendment? And if that's the case, what presumption was that based off of, in terms of where this decision was made, whether it was interpretation of the Second Amendment that was okay, whether it was legislative?
So this was the Supreme Court decision. This was the Supreme Court that made that determination. And the case, just to give you the background, Heller was a Washington, D.C. citizen, and he wanted to purchase a handgun for self-defense, but Washington, D.C. had passed a law saying you're not allowed to buy handguns. They basically banned handguns. And so he challenged that and went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court had to decide, well, what does the Second Amendment really mean? And what they decided was, number one, the Second Amendment does protect the right to own firearms for self-defense. And so then the question is, okay, well, what type of firearm and in what situation? So what Justice Scalia said was, the way he reasoned it was that the way that we define what is a weapon used for self-defense is basically what is the weapon that's most commonly used by citizens for self-defense. So what he did is looked at the data showing that most citizens will buy pistols or handguns for self-defense. And that's why he basically decided that what the Second Amendment protects is the right to own a handgun for self-defense. It's kind of an arbitrary decision, and it could change. Like if people start suddenly buying a different type of weapon and that becomes common, then it could change. But at least right now, at the time that he made the decision, he basically said that right now what it's protecting is a handgun, because that's the most commonly owned type of weapon for self-defense. All right, thank you so much for the invitation, guys. I really enjoyed being here. Thank you so much.